Howdy folks, you're watching Deuce. Does the buffer in your AR15, does it rattle? Well, mine rattles. I recently had a question from a newbie to the world of AR15s. I guess they had taken apart their first AR15 to clean it and lube it and whatnot, and they noticed that the buffer rattles. And they asked me if that was normal. Well, to make a long video short, yes. It is completely normal for the buffer to rattle. It should rattle, except for a very rare few situations, which I'll talk about at the end of the video. So, with that solved, why does it need to rattle? Let's talk about that. If you are not familiar with the inner workings of the AR15, I've got a stripped down. This is an AR15 pistol here, so there's no stock on here, but there is a buffer tube. This is where the buffer goes. The buffer sits right behind the bolt and bolt carrier, which is right here, which is what pushes the round into the chamber and fires it. Well, the buffer sits right back here and cycles back and forth as the bolt cycles back and forth. And of course, behind the buffer is a great big huge spring right here. So if I can get that to, there we go. So this huge spring is compressed in the buffer tube, and the buffer rides back and forth, chambering the next round. Now that everyone is up to speed on what a buffer does, why does it have to rattle? Well, let's take a look at that, because it is there to mitigate, come on, there we go. It is there to mitigate a phenomenon called bolt bounce. Now, when for one thing, there's a lot of spring back here, so there's a lot of spring pressure going forward, and the bolt will slam forward very, very quickly. It can slam forward so quickly that it will bounce back out of the chamber sometimes because it locks in, it screws in basically. It does like a little turn to lock in. And sometimes, actually very, very often, it will bounce back out a little bit when it slams home. Just like when you slam a door too hard, the door will bounce back out a little bit. Well, the same thing happens here. Now I'm going to try some slow motion photography here, and we can see what that bolt bounce actually looks like. But let's go ahead and take apart one of these buffers, and we'll take a look and see what exactly is inside one. So in a typical buffer, the whole buffer is a single piece of aluminum usually, and it has a rubber cap on the inside and one single, let me get my pointer out, and one single roll pin that holds the whole thing together. And then of course there's a weight, usually tungsten, inside. But there we go. It really is just an aluminum tube, just an empty aluminum tube with a cap on the end of it, and a heavy tungsten weight. That's all it is right there. A heavy tungsten weight inside an aluminum tube that rattles back and forth. So how does the addition of a single tungsten weight, how does adding that to a buffer and making it loose mitigate bolt bounce? Well, what happens is when everything is pressed together and nothing can move, then it all acts as a solid unit going forward. And just like slamming your front door or something, it can hit and then bounce back. So let's say this whole thing goes forward and slams a cartridge in and then bounces back. Well, before it can bounce back, the weight in here slams shut. It's a delayed action that basically the bolt hits, and then right behind it is the buffer tube weight. So basically it's almost like a 1-2 punch, bam, bam. And that's how it keeps the bolt bounce to a minimum. I went online to see what kind of other questions people had on the internet regarding buffers. And I came across a guy, actually a couple of people, who decided they didn't like that rattle, and they stuffed a piece of foam or a piece of paper or something there to keep it solid. That's a bad idea. But I've never tested it. So what I'm going to do, I've got a piece of paper over here. I'm going to eliminate the buffer rattle. There we go. Completely solid as rock now. I'm going to put this together, and we're going to get some slow-mo footage of a correct buffer and a solid buffer, basically a jinky homemade solid buffer here. Same weight except for that piece of paper. And we're going to get a slow motion video of the bolt bounce and compare them. It is always raining in Tennessee. Jesus. All right, well, hopefully I won't lose the power again. The first video here is of the proper buffer, the factory rattly buffer. While there is a small bit of bolt bounce, it is very, very little, very, very tiny, not even something to worry about. Here is a result of the buffer that has no rattle whatsoever. We homemade a rattleless buffer, and you can see there is a ton of bolt bounce. It bounces completely unlocked from the chamber. It completely comes unlocked from the lugs, which is crazy. That is insane how much a loose, rattling piece of tungsten, how much that helps the whole system work. Could the use of this incorrect buffer be dangerous? Kind of, but not really. And the reason is because Eugene Stoner, the inventor of the AR15, the designer, he was a freaking genius and one heck of an engineer. So he put in some mitigation to keep an out of battery ignition of the cartridge from happening. And the way he did that was basically, I mean, I could go into the details on it, but basically, if the bolt is unchambered, is not completely locked in, then the hammer will not make contact with the firing pin. So technically, while the bolt has bounced back out of the chamber, you could hit the trigger and release the hammer, but the hammer is just going to hit the side of the bolt carrier group and not the firing pin. So you more than likely won't have an explosive issue, but it could jam your weapon. You could have a situation where the hammer goes up and nothing happens, and you have a fail to ignite the cartridge because you didn't make contact with the firing pin. Now it's pretty easy to fix that by just cycling the cartridge out and putting a new one in, and you should be fine. There are a couple of companies out there that make buffers that do not rattle, and they are still correct. They still mitigate the bolt bounce issue. And I think Spikes is one of them. There's a couple of companies out there, and what they do is they still have a weight inside the buffer, and it's still free to move back and forth, but instead of a piece of solid tungsten, they use tungsten powder. So they have ground up tungsten, just a powderized tungsten, and it's still free to flow back and forth, and it still moves that weight back and forth as the buffer moves back and forth and cycles cartridges through the system. But it does not rattle back and forth because it is acting almost like a fluid because it's ground powderized tungsten, not a solid chunk like this. Before I made this video, I went online to verify that other people had this question, so it was a legitimate concern and video idea, and it was. Oh, there's more thunder. But it was a legitimate concern by many people on the internet, so I went ahead and decided to make a video about this. But I came across one great story. He said that during basic training, his drill sergeant told him that this was actually a flashlight. This was an emergency flashlight. If they were caught in the dark, they could take this buffer out of their AR-15s and shake it to charge the batteries. And so it was a whole group of them trying to be the first to light the end flashlight right there by shaking their buffer. I'm not sure how long they did that before they realized that their drill sergeant was full of crap, but that story really, that got me laughing right there. That was really funny. Well guys, if you want to stay on the Deuce and Guns channel, go ahead and click on one of these two videos right over here, and that will keep you watching away. If you have any comments, questions, video ideas, go ahead and leave that in the comment box of the video, and I'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. If you would hit the like button and subscribe, I have a lot more on the way. That really helps out my channel. And as always, you guys have a great day. See ya.